These rules apply to commercial users as well as non-commercial users. The idea behind this concept is to help conserve our biodiversity by sharing the benefits from its utilization in a fair and equitable way. All the concepts explained so far are now part of the protocol, which will enter into force when 50 parties have ratified it. This will facilitate access to genetic resources and the sharing of benefits arising from their use. The protocol is to enhance legal certainty for all parties involved in the utilization of genetic resources. And another important element was added to the protocol. Official checkpoints now have to be designated in countries where genetic resources are being utilized. Along the research and development chain, these checkpoints will help verify whether PIC has been obtained and MAP have been established. The collected information will then be sent to a special public database, the ABS Clearinghouse, where it can be reviewed by the country that has provided access to the resource. This procedure allows for the tracking of a genetic resource once it has left the provider country all the way to innovation and potential commercialization. This helps to ensure fair sharing of benefits if a product based on a genetic resource is introduced to the market. Now, all ratifying countries need to translate the provisions of the Nagoya Protocol into domestic laws or regulations that reflect the interests of all stakeholders concerned.
Both in the provider and in the user countries, it is time to get down to work. The governments have to discuss what goals they seek to achieve by ABS legislation in their own country, in cooperation with all groups concerned, holders of traditional knowledge, scientists, businesses, as well as NGOs campaigning for the conservation of biodiversity or for fair trade, and what steps are required on the way there.
The Nagoya Protocol is very clear. It really gives everybody a space to be able to be heard, to participate, and also to be able to implement it.
You also have to question how an adequate implementation of the Nagoya Protocol could look like in Switzerland. Are the existing measures sufficient, or do we need additional regulations? For example, take the measures meant to verify that the genetic resources have been obtained legally and that benefits have been shared fair and equitably. Now, who controls what and who is responsible for what? The situation Mr. Meyenberg mentioned before is that a Swiss company doesn't respect a South African legislation.
We're seeing that within the ABS there is a strong link with business, and we think the private sector is going to or should be a very key actor in this process.
Our goal here is not to necessarily, or our driving goal doesn't mean to make money. Our driving goal is to create a partnership and a pilot project to showcase the principles of return benefits for traditional knowledge.
That's what's good about it. Here in Switzerland, an approval process takes place. We all have the opportunity to give our views. Of course, we only want a few checkpoints. We want only what is really necessary, and nothing more.
It's an obligation now for the government. If you have already taken that Nagoya Protocol, you've signed for it, you've signed it and you have accepted it, you've even ratified it. It's your obligation now to make sure that you respect the rights of those communities, and you must recognize them.
To the African continent, we think it is now time for us as a region to be able to, in a very coordinated manner, see how we can ensure that every country translates the provisions of this protocol into their legislation such that one country is not a beneficiary while the other is not.
The first governments have made a start and signed the protocol. In accordance with the CBD decisions, every country now has up to 2015 at the latest to create the framework needed to let ABS become a reality to the benefit of nature and people. So, what important questions have to be addressed now?
What do we need to ratify the Nagoya Protocol? Who should be involved in the implementation of the ABS protocol in our country? Which representatives of interest groups? Which NGOs? Which local communities? Which authority is steering the process, gathering the proposals, and organizing the national authority, the focal point? How will access to the genetic resources be granted? How can traditional knowledge be protected and promoted? Who will profit from benefit sharing, and what sort of benefit sharing is suitable? How do we promote transparency and efficiency in the agreements? How do we ensure that the necessary processes take place within a reasonable time frame? What should an ABS certificate look like? What information should be transmitted to the ABS clearinghouse? What kind of legal standards do we need for PIC and MAT? Which existing legislation needs to be adapted? And what new legislation has to be passed to create the legal framework required?
Only when these questions have been addressed and the ABS regulations of the Nagoya Protocol have been put into practice will it be possible to share and use genetic resources on a fair basis. A win-win-win situation, to the benefit of the users, to the benefit of the providers, and of the conservation of nature.
Thank you very much for listening, watching. The ABS Capacity Development Initiative, we developed this film to explain what is ABS about. And the target audience are people who are not so familiar with the issues, who haven't been involved in the long negotiations leading to the Nagoya Protocol. We are using this film, for example, to brief parliamentarians in the ratification process, to make them aware what are the issues at stake, using these examples, real examples, highlighting and showcasing what different aspects of ABS are, or what different kinds of relationships between research and businesses and provider countries are involved, like the TEF case, where an agricultural resource is the key, is a resource which is being used, or the Woodya case, which based on traditional knowledge and leading to a patent which was filed, where a lot of the research was taking place actually before the CBD came into force, but also creating quite a showcase what are the elements which need to be addressed and what are the issues at stake. The film can be freely used for, of course, non-commercial purposes as usually, but if any one of you want to get the film to use it in your countries, we are happy to provide you with the links where you can download the film from our website so that you can use it in your awareness-raising issues and campaigns when you want to brief your cabinet members or the parliamentarian portfolio committees to make them aware what is ABS about. So that's all from my side. Is there any questions for clarification relating to the film? Maybe we can take if there's anything there. If not, I will hand over back to you. Yeah. Okay, then, yes, my presentation is already there. In the film already we saw a short introduction, what are some of the key elements in the Nagoya Protocol. With the presentation I want to look still a little bit deeper into some of the key provisions in the Nagoya Protocol and of the international ABS regime. Next slide please. The Convention on Biological Diversity has of course three objectives: the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the third objective is the fair and equitable sharing of benefits generated from the utilization of genetic resources. And how is this going to take place, this sharing of benefits? Through appropriate access to the genetic resources at the one side, the other side, the transfer of technology and know-how from the utilizing countries to the providing countries, and through appropriate funding of monetary benefits by upfront payments when you seek access at the time when you seek access, or milestone payments during the research development period, or then later on through royalties and license fees, as we saw, as it was mentioned also in one of the cases. The third objective was a key objective for the developing countries. They were very hard fighting for that, to have that in the convention. The developed countries were focusing very much in the negotiation process of the convention on the first two objectives, on the conservation and sustainable use. But then also the G77 group highlighted that if you want to have conservation and sustainable use, we have to share somehow, or we have to get access to some of the benefits which will be generated out of the utilization of our genetic resources. And one of the key questions in the negotiations was whether it should be biological resources or genetic resources in the third objective. And at the very last moment, the developed countries agreed if the wording is, the focus is on genetic resources, then we can agree to have this third objective in the convention. So that created then later on a lot of problems. The next slide, please. So the basic logic. Next. And next, is put out here. The resource-rich countries shall facilitate the access to the genetic resources of provider countries, and the user countries will provide the technology-rich countries at that time shall provide or share the benefits arising from the genetic resources and facilitate their access to technologies and means of important for the conservation and use. This was a basic deal at that time, based on an understanding and a perception that biotechnology is advancing very quickly, and that genetic resources are the key for future research and for the development of new products, but also was reflecting still a situation where developed countries were seen as those who are actually accessing genetic resources and utilizing genetic resources. But this has changed in the last 20 years. A lot of the so-called BRIC countries like Brazil, Malaysia, and so on have developed quite a state of research capacities, and they are now also utilizing genetic resources. South Africa as well, we saw it in the example of the Hoodia case, where the South African government-run or government-funded research institute was developing this Hoodia patent. So also developing countries are now at a point where they are user countries. So they are not only provider countries, but they are users and providers at the same time. So that has changed compared to the situation when the CBD 20 years ago was being negotiated. Next slide, please. The basic concept, when we talk about genetic resources, we talk about animal, plant, and microbial resources, which can be found anywhere within national borders, national jurisdiction, but also beyond national borders and national jurisdiction in the high seas or in the Arctic areas. Genetic resources are used for many different purposes. Basic research, taxonomy, ecological research, but also for commercial purposes, to develop products in the pharmaceutical and the cosmetic sector, and in seed and crop protection, personal care products, in botanicals and horticulture, farm animal breeding. These are all issues which are of relevance when you talk about ABS and when you talk about implementing ABS at the national level. And in this transaction from the genetic resource through the research and commercialization process to the product which is then on the market at the very end, it's usually not just a provider, one company, and usually it's a long chain of intermediates where one research company, for example in the Hoodia case, the South African Research Organization was doing the basic research, developing the patent. licensing that to a startup biotech company in the UK, which further developed the patent, which then licensed the patent further on to Pfizer and later on to Unilever. And so you usually have these chains of users which are between the resource where the original access has been granted and given and the final product. So that is also complicating the situation a little bit. Next slide, please. So what is the international regime on ABS about? The convention was already mentioned. It's a legally binding instrument for its parties. And Article 15 is a key article on access and benefit sharing, where the key principles for access and benefit sharing are fleshed out. Prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms are the two key elements which are regulating the relationship between the user and the provider. Prior informed consent means that you have to disclose, it's the one who seeks access to a genetic resource has to disclose basic information, why, what for he wants to have access to a resource. And the mutually agreed terms could be a contract or a material transfer agreement where it's stated what can be the resource being used for, and what are the utilization rights, and what are the benefit sharing requirements if anything is being developed out of it. Article 8J also needs to be mentioned because that relates to the traditional knowledge which is being associated with genetic resources. Article 8J of the convention in a very general manner obliges parties to ensure that benefit sharing from the utilization of traditional knowledge is taking place with the providers of such knowledge. And Article 16 and 19 relate to technology transfer and biotech research and the involvement of the providers of genetic resources, but we don't need to go into the details here. Next slide. Further elements of the international regime on ABS are, of course, the Bonn guidelines, which have been negotiated in 1999 and adopted at the COP6 in The Hague in 2000. A voluntary agreement, a guideline, which provides guidance on how to draft ABS agreements. What are the key elements which need to be in ABS agreements to be fair and equitable, based on the convention's principles of PIC and MAT, and what needs to be addressed in national regulations on ABS. Since the Bonn guidelines are a voluntary instrument, immediately after their adoption, the African group called for and asked for some legally binding instrument, that a voluntary instrument wouldn't be sufficient. And that led in the very end to the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol, which is legally binding for its parties. So far, 93 parties to the convention, or 92 parties to the convention have signed the protocol, ratified. So far have, it's 5 or 6? 5. But there are many more countries in the process of ratification or accession to the protocol, and it's expected that for the next COP in 2014, most probably the protocol will enter into force. Another important treaty which needs to be mentioned as part of the international ABS regime is the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture under the FAO, which regulates access and benefit sharing, or fleshes out some basic principles for access and benefit sharing for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, but only if they are used for food and agriculture. If they are not being used for food and agriculture, the Nagoya Protocol would apply. And an important element of the international treaty is the so-called multilateral system, which provides very easy access to a number of listed crops, food and fodder crops, to ensure or contribute to food security. Next, to mention before we go into this one, other elements which are important are the UNCLOS, which is in the process of negotiating also an ABS regime on ABS agreement for the high seas. the WHO is also in the process of setting up a system for benefit sharing for pandemic diseases. So you see there are also sectoral approaches to certain sets of genetic resources which require maybe more special treatment, special considerations when access and benefit sharing should take place. So let's have a little bit of a deeper look into some of the key provisions of the Nagoya Protocol, which are especially important for national implementation. And as I mentioned before, the CBD, when the CBD was negotiated, the agreement was for the third objective that it should focus on genetic resources. And everybody was discussing what is the difference between a biological resource and a genetic resource. And it was creating a lot of confusion and a lot of legal insecurity. What can we do? What are we allowed to do? And the Nagoya Protocol, because of these complications, trying to take a different approach from the CBD. Instead of continuing the discussion to differentiate between access to a biological resource and access to a genetic resource, the Nagoya Protocol is looking at what does actually mean the